In September 1950, the United States Navy sprayed bacteria over an American city. Hundreds of thousands of people inhaled it without consent, and the government did not publicly admit what happened for more than 2 decades. By the end, you'll know why San Francisco was chosen, how the bacteria entered homes, what happened inside one local hospital, and the unsettling reason officials still considered the operation a success. Picture yourself waking near San Francisco Bay on September 20, 1950. The Korean War is 3 months old. American officials fear that Soviet forces could attack the United States with biological weapons. There are no modern detection networks, no established emergency protocols, and almost no reliable data showing how a biological cloud would move through a crowded city. Military planners want answers. How far could airborne organisms travel? Could they cross the shoreline? Could they penetrate offices, apartments, restaurants, and transit stations? Most importantly, could an enemy ship quietly expose an entire urban population? To test that scenario, the Navy positions a vessel off the coast. From offshore equipment, personnel release a mist containing enormous numbers of microscopic organisms. The targets are not soldiers on a closed base. They are ordinary people going to work, opening windows, boarding streetcars, and sending children to school. They are not warned because warning them would change their behavior. And to the planners, realistic behavior is essential. The city itself has become the laboratory, and nearly everyone inside it is an unwitting test subject. The experiment is called Operation Sea Spray. Over several days, Navy personnel dispersed 2 bacterial agents, Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii, an organism now classified within the Bacillus subtilis group. At the time, military researchers described these as harmless simulants. They are selected partly because laboratories can identify them after release. Serratia produces a distinctive reddish pigment under certain conditions, making it easier to trace. The Navy places collection devices throughout the Bay Area. As the cloud moves inland, samples reveal where the organisms travel and how concentrated they remain. The results are dramatic. Particles spread across San Francisco and into neighboring communities. Later military estimates suggest that a large portion of the city's roughly 800,000 residents may have been exposed. Some calculations indicate that people inhaled thousands of particles during the trials. From a military perspective, this answers the central question: a biological agent released from offshore could reach deep into a coastal city. But the phrase, harmless simulant, is doing an extraordinary amount of work, because harmless to whom? Here is the contradiction at the center of Sea Spray. Researchers did not believe they were risking lives. Yet they were deliberately testing whether living organisms could infiltrate a population, while lacking the medical knowledge needed to guarantee those organisms were safe. Serratia marcescens was commonly treated as non-pathogenic. But, not known to cause disease, is not the same as, cannot cause disease. It is now recognized as an opportunistic pathogen. It can cause infections, particularly in hospitalized people, newborns, and patients with weakened immune systems. That distinction changes everything. A healthy adult might encounter the organism without obvious consequences. A vulnerable patient recovering from surgery might not. The experiment therefore depended on an invisible gamble, that every exposed person would respond like the healthiest theoretical subject. No one asked residents about chronic illness. No one excluded hospitals from the test zone. No one obtained informed consent. And days after the releases began, something unusual appeared at Stanford Hospital. But before we get to that, you need to understand something even stranger. Sea Spray was not a rogue operation improvised by a few officers. It belonged to a much broader Cold War testing program. For years, the United States military released biological or chemical tracers in public spaces to measure how potential attacks might spread. Tests occurred in transportation systems, military facilities, coastal areas, and populated regions. Researchers used organisms, fluorescent particles, and other materials intended to imitate biological agents. The logic was brutally simple: laboratory models could not reproduce a living city. Buildings altered airflow. Weather shifted without warning. Commuters carried particles into enclosed spaces. Ventilation systems moved material between rooms. Only real environments could produce real data. That reasoning converted civilians into environmental variables. The scientists measured wind direction, particle concentration, and geographic coverage. What they did not systematically measure was the health of every person beneath the cloud. So when illness followed, officials could argue that the experiment had not caused it. After all, they had designed the test to track dispersal, not human consequences. That gap would become the government's strongest defense. Between late September and early October 1950, doctors at Stanford Hospital encountered something they considered remarkable. 11 patients developed urinary tract infections involving Serratia marcescens. The organism was unusual enough in that clinical setting that physicians documented the cluster in a medical report. One patient, Edward Nevin, had entered the hospital for prostate surgery. Serratia was found in his infection, and he died weeks later after complications involving his heart. Was Operation Sea Spray responsible? The timing is disturbing. The bacterial species matches one used by the Navy. The cluster appeared soon after the releases. And the hospital sat within the wider area reached by the airborne material. But the evidence has limits. No preserved sample conclusively connected the hospital strain to the Navy's strain. Nevin was already medically vulnerable, and later government reviews disputed that the test caused his death. That uncertainty matters. It prevents the case from becoming clean, courtroom-level proof. But it does not erase the ethical reality. The Navy exposed the public first, and studied the possibility of harm only after questions emerged. Now the main reveal. Operation Sea Spray was considered successful because it demonstrated that San Francisco could be penetrated by an offshore biological attack. Collection stations detected the organisms across a broad urban area. The city's famous fog and coastal winds did not protect it. Streets, buildings, and human routines helped transform the release into a citywide exposure model. The experiment proved something larger than military planners expected: modern cities are not sealed structures. They breathe. Air moves through windows, corridors, tunnels, hospitals, and homes. A microscopic cloud does not need to break down a door. The architecture draws it inside. That was the payoff the Navy wanted. But the human cost was never calculated with the same precision. Researchers could estimate particle counts and dispersal patterns, yet they could not reconstruct every infection, every complication, or every vulnerable person who inhaled the material. So the official success contained its own indictment. The government learned that an enemy could expose an American city, by exposing an American city itself. For years, residents knew none of this. The operation entered public view during the 1970s, as congressional investigations examined secret military and intelligence experiments conducted on American citizens. The Navy acknowledged the San Francisco releases. Suddenly, an event remembered as ordinary foggy weather became part of a national argument about consent, secrecy, and government power. Edward Nevin's family sued the federal government, alleging that the experiment caused his death. The courts ultimately rejected the claim, concluding that causation had not been proven and that the government was protected under existing legal doctrines. Legally, the family lost. Historically, the case exposed a deeper problem. Officials had created conditions in which definitive answers might never be possible. Residents had not been notified. Doctors had not been told to monitor for exposure. No comprehensive health surveillance followed the operation. The absence of evidence was then used as evidence of absence. You were safe, the reasoning implied, because no one had gathered enough information to prove otherwise. Sea spray is often described as proof that the government poisoned San Francisco. The more accurate story is also more unsettling. Officials used organisms they believed were safe, but they tested that belief on people who never agreed to participate. They prioritized military realism over informed consent. And when possible harm appeared, secrecy made the truth almost impossible to reconstruct. That is how many forgotten government experiments survive scrutiny, not through one perfect smoking gun, but through a chain of documented decisions that no ethical review board would accept today. The lesson is not that every unexplained illness came from the Navy. It is that certainty was treated as a requirement for the victims, but merely an inconvenience for the people running the test. The planners did not need certainty before releasing bacteria. Only the public needed certainty before it was allowed to object. Operation Sea Spray did not stay buried because the documents vanished. It stayed buried because almost no one knew they should look. If this broke your brain a little, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. Next time, the Vela incident, a nuclear flash no nation claimed, when a satellite detected something over the ocean that government still cannot, or will not, fully explain.